I feel so lucky that I've known my producer and co-writer Sawyer through his transition from female to male. And being with him on that journey has been one of the most rewarding, sometimes challenging, but ultimately inspiring journeys that I've ever experienced.
Should we do it again?
Oh, this is Sawyer!
Hey. Say that thing about that. I wasn't expecting that.
Oh.
Okay, one more take.
Okay. I'm Tiffany Shlain. I'm a mother, filmmaker. I founded the Webby Awards. And this series is about how the future doesn't start somewhere far off in the distance. The future starts here. So when we first started making films together 8 years ago, you were the first trans person I'd ever met.
That's pretty cool.
Cool.
But I bet, you know, you may have also met other trans people before without knowing it.
I mean, like if someone met you today.
Right, would you know that I was trans if we passed each other on the street?
I didn't know.
I didn't know. Thanks, guys.
But I mean, in the 8 years since you've been transitioning, it really feels like culture has been transitioning. I mean, you hear the word trans, it's out there, and I mean, it just...
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I started seeing it in the queer communities about 10 years ago. All of a sudden, there was this explosion of trans identities. There was more access to hormones, more access to surgeries. We had the internet, we could connect and find information. The queer movement had gained all this momentum. And we started to use terms that, to me, felt more open, like genderqueer.
And trans.
And trans, as opposed to transsexual, which always felt so daunting to me at the time.
That's not used very much, right?
It is for some people. And for some people, gender is much more fluid, less defined. And more options just means more room for people to come out. I mean, it's still vulnerable to come out as trans. It's still scary. It's still not all that safe. But I do agree that we're starting to see a shift. People are becoming more familiar with it.
The day I let her go to school in girl clothes, she was happier than I had seen in a very long time.
I remember when my daughter Odessa met you, and she's like, Mommy, he looks like a man but sounds like a woman. And I was like, well, that's because he identifies as a man. And she was like, oh, okay. I loved how seamless it was for her. I mean, for me, I kept getting the pronouns wrong. I would stumble on the right pronoun, then I'd feel bad, and you'd feel bad, and then I'd feel worse, and it was this horrible cycle.
It was hard. But you know, a lot of people struggle with it. I think that's one more thing that's gonna shift. It's a new concept for a lot of people. And sometimes it just takes a minute to wrap your head around it.
Well, what do you know?
It took more than a minute. But how much of this shift is that there are literally more people transitioning, or are we just seeing and hearing about it more?
I think both. I mean, there are definitely more of us now, but it's also not new. I remember in college when I was sort of exploring it all and reading everything I could, it was very powerful to learn that for many centuries, trans people were not only accepted, they were revered. It was all throughout ancient literature. Even Cupid was originally portrayed as intersex, both a god and goddess of love.
So when did that change?
Well, in the Western world, patriarchy spread around the Middle Ages, and gender roles became more rigid. But for hundreds of years, as difficult as it was, people kept pushing those boundaries. And I look at every one of those stories as slowly carving out a place that I now get to live in.
Yeah, I remember when Boys Don't Cry came out, and that was the first time I heard a story about a trans person.
And that was a hugely impactful film, but it was also a story about someone being killed. And I don't think I realized this at the time, but the story wasn't told from the trans perspective. It was told by somebody else.
Which is really where the internet and social media has changed things today.
Exactly. People are able to tell their own stories.
You told me once about that you changed your gender on Friendster.
Well, that's this interesting thing. You know, our social media identities are separate from our physical bodies. So I remember sitting there, no hormones, no surgeries at that point, but I could switch my gender on Friendster, and all of a sudden to the world, I was a man, and I had this power to tell my own story.
That must have been so empowering.
It was.
And now those stories are starting to move from online to mainstream shows.
And there are so many important conversations happening because of it. And what I love most about these shows is that they're just trans people being people, you know, dealing with love and life and family. Being trans is just one aspect of who we are. And there are transgender people who don't even identify as trans. They just want to be a man or a woman and not even think about it.
So where do you fall in all that? I mean, we're doing this show right now, so now everybody's gonna know.
It's complicated.
It's definitely complicated.
On the one hand, I love shifting people's assumptions about gender.
Messing with them.
Totally messing with them. Like, I love that moment when I get to look at somebody, what are you doing over there? You know, sometimes I just drop it, I'm like, I'm transgender. And their minds are like, what?
The gender bomb.
They're like, oh, I just kind of thought you were gay. But on the other hand, my life would be a lot easier if I just walked through life passing. I mean, gender has been this huge presence my whole life. You know, years of just awkward. My voice and body didn't reflect me, and I was very quiet for most of my life.
You were quiet? I don't know that.
Very quiet, very quiet. And transitioning, as difficult as that actual process is, gave me my voice. And now part of me just wants to live my life. I married an amazing person.
She's amazing.
Who encourages me to just be me. We moved to a quiet neighborhood. We want to start a family. And it's kind of like my gender doesn't need to be anyone else's business, finally.
But by sharing your story, it's making room for other people.
And that's why it's complicated. And I think sometimes it just takes connecting to one story for somebody to say, okay, I get it.
And with more and more stories out there and people being open to them, that's when lives change.
That's exactly it. And I think this shift that we're experiencing or starting to experience it's not just by trans people, it's by everybody. You know, it's you teaching your kids that that's okay.
Right.
And it's my parents who are totally
so
amazing and supportive. And they tell all of their friends. And it's all the kids today, whether it's my family or neighbors or kids I see walking down the street. I look at them and think, wow, you're growing up in a world that's starting to think this is okay.
I'm Tiffany Shlain. I'm a mother, filmmaker. I founded the Webby Awards. And this series is about how the future doesn't start somewhere far off in the distance. The future starts here.